Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if this is your first video with me. Today I want to explain to you a very difficult, terrible verb form that everybody hates. If you're guessing that we're going to be talking about the congiuntivo, you guessed correctly. Why am I saying it's terrible? Well, it's terrible because even Italians have problems with this. Italians actually have a hard time using it and very often misuse it or don't conjugate it correctly, or they just simply use another verb tense instead of the subjunctive. Some linguistic gurus have been telling us that the subjunctive will eventually disappear from the Italian language. I don't know if that's true or not, but they're talking about a very slow evolution. So we're talking about hundreds of years from today, which means that unfortunately you have to learn it and use it correctly now. Please take note that using it correctly is a sign of a higher education, okay? Usually, even the Italians that do not use this correctly fall under a category of, wait a minute, you did not study a lot in school, did you? So it's not nice to not use it correctly, okay? Now, don't worry, because I really worked hard for this video because I want to make sure that you understand it, you get it right, and you're going to be learning it in a very slow way. Not because I'm slow teaching, but because I really think that if you get it right now, you will never have problems with it in the future. Okay? You can always download the PDF of this lesson by clicking on the link that you find below this video. If you don't like clicking on the links, don't worry. All of this information is available for free on my website at italianlanguagehub.com. Check out the blog section. Okay? Without further ado, let's get to understanding what this terrible verb tense is all about and how we're going to use it, how we can conjugate it, and what it really is, okay? The first thing that you need to know, and you need to know it because it just makes things a little bit easier if you understand this mechanism, is what is a main clause and a dependent clause. These two structures are important because they will help you to put together the formula of the subjunctive. So if you don't know what they are, it's not a problem. You can forget about them right after you watch this video. But for now, you have to know that a clause is a set of words that together creates a sentence. Okay, this is a very basic explanation of what a clause is. For your understanding of the Italian subjunctive, you need to understand that you are going to use the main clause and the dependent clause. The main clause is a group of words that can be written out and that makes sense and stands on its own. For example, if I say, I met her in Rome, full stop, that's a sentence. It makes sense. It has a verb, it has a subject. It can stay there and it can make sense by itself. If I have a sentence like this, I met her in Rome, where I lived as a teenager. If you want to focus on what your main clause is, it's the part that makes sense even without anything before it or after it. So I would say in this case that the first section, I met her in Rome, is your main clause. Then you have where, that in this case will connect two parts of the sentence. And then you have the last part. I lived as a teenager. As you can see, if I simply said I lived as a teenager, you're like, okay, but what are you talking about? It doesn't really make sense by itself, okay? So that's your dependent clause. Use the word dependent to understand that it needs something in order to make sense. And in this case, it needs the main clause, okay? That was the quick, super quick, straightforward information that you need to know on main clause and dependent clause. Why do you need this information? Because we are going to focus on the main clause, because the main clause is very important to understanding when you need to use the subjunctive. So, before we look at any kind of conjugation, before we look at any other information, let's focus on what a main clause that triggers your brain into understanding that you need to use the subjunctive looks like in Italian. So you can have a main clause that looks like this: penso che, spero che, voglio che. So you have a verb, you have che. Your dependent clause comes after the che. And most of the time, your dependent clause is the clause that will have the verb conjugated at the congiuntivo, so at the Italian subjunctive. Let's look at a couple of examples. Penso che tu sia bellissimo. So you have your main clause, penso che. After that, you have your dependent clause. In this case, the dependent clause is conjugated at the subjunctive. Sia is your verb conjugated at the Italian subjunctive. Spero che domani non piova. Once again, you have spero che, your main clause. Domani non piova is your dependent clause with the subjunctive. So piova is the subjunctive of the verb piovere. Sometimes, as you have noticed in the first example, you often use personal subject pronouns inside of these sentences. So very often you will have sentences like penso che tu sia bellissimo. Penso che lei sia intelligente. So you very often have tu, lui, lei, and so on. You will see that it's quite often used in the subjunctive forms. Okay? But I think that now that you understand what main clauses and dependent clauses are, you are ready to understand what the subjunctive verb tense is. And then we're going to be looking at when we use it, and we're actually going to look at the conjugation. Okay? So, what is the Italian subjunctive? The subjunctive is a verb tense that you will use when you're expressing opinions, feelings, doubts, uncertainties, possibilities, wishes, okay? You will use the main clause that will trigger the use of the subjunctive form in the dependent clause. This is 99% of the time the structure. Which means that to understand if you need the subjunctive in the dependent clause, you can focus and analyze your verbs and your expressions found or used in the main clause. For once, there is actually a list of expressions and of verbs that you can actually study. And this list, learning this list, will help your brain to trigger the subjunctive in the second or the dependent clause, okay? So I strongly suggest to learn these. I will show you a couple of these expressions, but there's many more. So if you want the full list, be sure to download the PDF that you can find by clicking on the link under this video, or you can just go on my blog page at italianlanguagehub.com and you can look at the full list there as well. Okay, so every time you have these expressions, you know that afterwards you will need to use the Italian subjunctive. So verbs that are typically used to express opinion, uncertainty, possibility, or doubt will trigger the use of the subjunctive. So you can have verbs like pensare che, dubitare che, credere che. You can also have verbs that express feelings So like happiness or maybe fear. Here are a couple of examples of verbs like this. Essere felice che. Temere che. Or you can have verbs that express wishes, like volere che, preferire che, desiderare che. Okay? So look at these expressions, learn them, study them, and make sure that they are yours. You can create sentences with something that makes sense for you, in a context that makes sense for you, so that you're internalizing them. Okay? So in this case, when you have a main clause with some of these expressions or verbs, you know that your dependent clause will need to have a subjunctive verb tense. But you can also use the Italian subjunctive verb tense when you're talking about, or more than talking, when you're using impersonal verbs. Okay, so those verbs that do not have an explicit subject. So the subject is not specifically said inside of the sentence. Okay, once again, I'm going to be giving you a few expressions that use this impersonal form. The full list is on my blog page. Basta che, bisogna che, vale la pena che. Okay? There are also a lot of impersonal expressions that will trigger the use of the subjunctive, and these are, let's say you can spot these out because they are created with the verb to be. For example, è bene che, è difficile che, è giusto che, è importante che. Okay? Once again, there are a lot more. Okay, look them up on my blog page or on the PDF that you can download by clicking on the link below and start learning them. Be careful and remember that you're going to use the subjunctive when you're talking about things that are not certain, okay? If, on the other hand, you have an impersonal expression that talks about something that is certain, you are not going to use the subjunctive, but you're going to be using the indicative. Let's look at a couple of expressions that will make you understand that you're talking about something that's certain. So, for example, if you have an expression like è certo che, it's certain that, you're talking about certainty. You're talking about something that is certain, okay? È evidente che, è ovvio che. All of these expressions will need an indicative verb tense and not a subjunctive. Okay, very, very important information here. All of these expressions, all of these examples that I have given you will trigger the use of the subjunctive if the subject of the main clause and the dependent clause is different. Look at this example and understand what I'm talking about. Penso che Maria sia bellissima. You have penso che, so you have your main clause with the verb pensare che, which triggers the subjunctive in the dependent clause. Maria sia bellissima. Let's break down these two sections. The first part, penso che, the subject is the first person. I think that. Okay? The second part, so the dependent clause, the subject is no longer the first person, but it's Maria. So, lei, third person singular. In this case, you have two different subjects. One is mentioned in the main clause and the other one in the dependent clause, and they are different. For this reason, you will be able to use the subjunctive. When you have the same subject, so a sentence where you have the same subject In the main clause and the dependent clause, you are not going to be using the subjunctive, but you're going to be using a verb in the infinitive form. Let's look at a couple of examples. Mauro pensa di essere molto bello. So you have Mauro pensa, you have the verb pensare, which could link your brain to the subjunctive, but you have to look at the subject. Mauro pensa di essere molto bello. The subject is always Mauro, okay? In both the first section and the second section of the sentence. Another example, lei è felice di aver passato l'esame. Once again, it's only one subject. She's happy to have passed the exam. I don't have more than one person, more than one subject in this sentence, okay? So remember, you will use a subjunctive when you have those expressions that will trigger its use, but also when the two subjects of the main clause and the dependent clause are different. Now, we can finally look at the conjugation of the subjunctive. This is actually the easy part, okay? So if you need to take a break, look at your notes, relax, and let's jump into the conjugation. We're going to look at the regular verbs first, okay? I'm going to show you how you conjugate the three different verbs in Italian, so the ones that end with are, the ones that end with ere, and the ones that end with ire. This is actually quite easy for once because the first, the second, and the third person singular are the same. I'm focusing on the present tense of the subjunctive, okay? So if you're conjugating the subjunctive at the present tense, you have to learn that the first, second, and the third person singular are conjugated exactly the same, which is wonderful, right? So if you memorize this verb that will appear on the screen, you know that all of the other regular verbs will be conjugated at the same way. This is for the verb category that has an ending with are, A-R-E. For example, the verb parlare or the verb amare. I will put the little word che and the conjugation because I think that if you repeat it and you conjugate it with that, your brain picks up that it's subjunctive. I think it's a little help for your brain. So let's look at the verb amare. Che io ami, che tu ami, che lui, lei ami, che noi amiamo, che voi amiate, che loro amino. So remember this conjugation for all of the verbs that end with A-R-E. Memorize that the first, second, and third person singular are the same. You have probably noticed that the noi, so the first person plural, is conjugated just like the present tense, which is something nice, okay? But remember this, how the endings are, and you will always conjugate correctly all of the verbs that are regular and that end in A-R-E. How about the verbs that end with E-R-E, like prendere, ridere. Let's conjugate ridere. Che io rida, che tu rida, che lui, lei rida, che noi ridiamo, che voi ridiate, che loro ridano. Okay? Once again, memorize the endings and conjugate all of the other regular verbs just like this. And what about the verbs that end with IRE? Like aprire or dormire. This is how you are going to conjugate them. Che io dorma, che tu dorma, che lui lei dorma, che noi dormiamo, che voi dormiate, che loro dormano. Once again, memorize the endings. My suggestion here is to take some verbs that have these different endings and to just write them out, conjugate them using that little che and the subject pronoun. Your brain will slowly memorize it, will pick it up, trust me. Obviously, there are lots of irregular conjugations, and the irregular verbs of the subjunctive are actually very important. Why do I say this? Because they're very common. They're used in everyday Italian language. So I strongly suggest that you learn at least the most common conjugations, okay? I will show you the most common ones now, but please go on my website and see the full list with all of the other ones, okay, that you can also learn. Let's focus on the two most common irregular verbs, which are the verb to be, essere, and to have, avere. This is how they are conjugated. Che io sia, che tu sia, che lui lei sia, che noi siamo, che voi siate, che loro siano. How about the verb avere, to have? Che io abbia, che tu abbia, che lui lei abbia, che noi abbiamo, che voi abbiate, che loro abbiano. As you have noticed, if you want to tackle and learn correctly the irregular verbs, you can start by learning the first person singular. So for example, in the verb essere, sia. The verb avere, abbia. Because as you can see, this is carried down on all of the other subjects, okay? So learn those first and then master the entire conjugation. These are my suggestions. So please, I strongly advise that you learn at least how you conjugate these verbs. Essere, sia, avere, abbia, andare, vada, fare, faccia, dire, dica, dare, dia, volere, voglia. Once again, there are many more, but focus on these. Take them, write them out, write the conjugation out. Immerse yourself. Once your brain understands the mechanism, you will no longer be thinking about the conjugation. It will just click and you will just say it correctly. Okay? Now, to finish off the world of irregularities, if you've been studying Italian for a while now, you know that the verbs that end with CARE or GARE always have an irregular conjugation. So you have a little extra H that sort of throws itself inside of the verb conjugations. Let's take the verb pagare, so a verb that finishes with GARE. Let's conjugate it at the present tense. So indicative, very simple present tense. Io pago, tu paghi. You see that little extra H that jumped in there? Lui lei paga, noi paghiamo. Once again, you have a little H. Voi pagate, loro pagano. Okay, that little extra H will be taken to the irregular conjugation of the subjunctive. Okay, so this is how this verb, and you can take it as a reference verb for all of the verbs that end in GARE. This is what happens with that little extra H. Che io paghi, che tu paghi, che lui lei paghi. As you see, the H is used all the way down. These were the first three conjugation in the singular form, but let's look at what happens in the plural form. Che noi paghiamo, che voi paghiate, che loro paghino. Okay, so with the verbs that end with GARE, that little extra H sort of is woven into also the subjunctive conjugation. The same exact thing with verbs that end with CARE, like the verb cercare. So think of the present tense, io cerco, tu cerchi, lui lei cerca, noi cerchiamo, voi cercate, loro cercano. So you have that little extra H that sort of jumps in at the present tense. It will be kept also with the subjunctive. Cerchi, che tu cerchi, che lui lei cerchi, che noi cerchiamo, che voi cerchiate, che loro cerchino. Okay? So remember this little irregularity that is kept also with the subjunctive. It's even stronger because you will have the H all the way down to the full conjugation. So singular, plural, all the subjects will have that H. One last information before I let you go. With this video, we've focused on the present tense of the subjunctive. Okay, you do actually have other verb tenses, but this is the most common one. Okay, understand this one. Make sure you're using it correctly before you attempt to learn the other forms of the subjunctive, okay? So don't worry if your brain is like smoking right now. I gave you lots of information. This is a very rich lesson. Hopefully it was clear and I gave you all of the information that you needed in order to understand it correctly. Please, practice makes perfect. Use it, incorporate it in your Italian language, make sentences, and have your brain click into being triggered automatically to use the subjunctive in Italian. If you want to do like lots and lots of exercises, I do have a book that I strongly suggest. This is what it looks like. It's a book by Alma Edizioni. It's a grammar book. You do also have an English version of it. I think there's an ebook version. I will put all of the links under here if you want to buy it. It's available on Amazon and also directly on their website. The publisher Alma is super nice. So if you have trouble getting the book, they will tell you where to buy it also locally if you tell them where you live. So they're super nice. Or if you need any help, just email me at julia@italianlanguagehub.com and I will be more than happy to help you find the book. Okay? This is it for today. Go relax. Okay? Very sorry if I stressed you out too much today, but I was really, really looking forward to giving you this lesson today. Okay? Un bacione a tutti. Ciao.